April 6, 1936. That date is seared into the memory of anyone from North Georgia who lived through it or who heard the stories passed down from their grandparents. But to understand what happened that day, you have to understand Gainesville first. Gainesville was a proud little city, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the Chattahoochee River curves south. It was known as the Queen City of the Mountains, a place where the air smelled like pine and the red clay roads baked hard in the spring sun. The town was built on cotton and textiles on the hard work of farmers and mill workers. It had a bustling downtown square with a courthouse at its center, brick storefronts, a post office, and churches that anchored every neighborhood. People knew each other by name. They sat on their front porches in the evening and listened to the whippoorwills. It was a simple, sturdy kind of life. By the spring of 1936, the Great Depression still had a tight grip on the country, but Gainesville was holding on. The textile mills were running, the farmers were planting, and the Works Progress Administration had put men to work building new roads and public buildings. Money was still scarce, but hope was slowly returning. That Sunday, April 5th, had been Palm Sunday. Families had gone to church in their best clothes, had eaten fried chicken dinners, and had children playing in the yards. The weather that day had been warm and pleasant, almost too warm for early April. A few people noticed the air felt heavy, thick, like the weight of a coming storm pressing down on everything. But it was spring in Georgia and spring meant storms. Nobody thought much of it. Monday morning, April 6th, dawned clear and bright. The sun came up hot, and by mid-morning the temperature was already climbing into the 70s. The humidity was suffocating. People wiped their foreheads with handkerchiefs and said it felt like summer had come early. At the mills, the looms clattered and hummed. In the fields, sharecroppers bent over rows of cotton. In town, shopkeepers swept their sidewalks and propped open their doors to catch any breeze that might stir. Children walked to school, carrying their lunch pails. The air was still, too still. The leaves on the oak trees along Green Street hung limp and motionless. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, but the sound seemed to get swallowed by the stillness. By early afternoon, the sky began to change. It started as a faint yellowish-green tint in the west, the kind of color that old-timers recognized as trouble. The wind picked up, gusting and shifting, swirling dust and loose papers along the streets. Then the clouds came rolling in, not the gentle, puffy clouds of a spring afternoon, but dark, boiling masses that churned and twisted. The barometric pressure dropped sharply. People felt it in their ears, a popping sensation. The birds went silent. The air turned cool, then cold, and then it began to rain. Not a gentle rain, but fat, heavy drops that came down in sheets, almost sideways with the force of the wind. At the Gainesville Midland Railroad Depot, the station master watched the sky with a worried frown. He had been through storms before, but this one felt different. The clouds were rotating, a slow, ominous spin. He rang the bell on the platform and shouted for everyone to take cover, but it was too late for warnings. The tornado that would level Gainesville was already forming, already touching down somewhere south of town, a long black funnel that chewed up the Georgia countryside as it moved northeast. The first sign of real trouble came at about 2:30 in the afternoon. In the southern part of town, near the cotton fields, a freight train engineer saw a wall of debris, dust, boards, and what looked like pieces of a barn spinning and flying in the air. He blew his whistle long and hard, a desperate wail that cut through the rain, but there was no stopping what was coming. The tornado was a half-mile wide at its base, a monstrous column of black fury. It moved at an estimated 60 miles per hour, cutting a path of destruction through the heart of the city. In the mill neighborhoods, the houses were small wooden frame houses built close together. They never stood a chance. The wind ripped roofs off like they were paper, tore walls apart, and lifted whole structures off their foundations and tossed them into the streets. People who were inside had no time to run. The tornado's roar was deafening, a constant low rumble that grew into a shrieking whistle as it passed. Eyewitnesses said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains running at once. At the Gainesville Cotton Mill, the largest employer in town, the men and women working at the looms heard the noise and felt the building shake. Some dropped to the floor. Others tried to run for the door. But the mill was a massive brick structure 4 stories high, built to last. But no building could withstand the force of that tornado. The wind hit the mill like a fist. The southern wall collapsed inward, bringing the upper floors down in a cascade of bricks, steel, and shattered machinery. Hundreds of workers were trapped inside. The dust and smoke and screams rose up into the black sky. Across town, the tornado struck the downtown district. The courthouse, which had stood solid for decades, had its roof torn off and its clock tower crumpled like a tin can. The post office, the bank, the five and dime, all were destroyed or badly damaged. Bricks and glass flew through the air like shrapnel. Cars were overturned, telephone poles snapped like toothpicks, and the big oak trees that lined the streets were uprooted and thrown onto the tops of buildings. One of the worst tragedies happened at the Fair Street School. It was a two-story brick building, and many of the town's children were inside taking afternoon classes. When the tornado struck, the building collapsed. The second floor pancaked onto the first. Teachers and students were buried under tons of rubble. Rescue workers would spend hours digging through the debris, listening for the cries of the trapped. The scene was chaos. Neighbors ran to the school, pulling at bricks with their bare hands, screaming for their children. On Grove Street, a young mother named Mary Thomas was home with her 3 children when she heard the roar. She grabbed her youngest and pushed the other 2 under the heavy oak dining table. The wind tore the front door off its hinges and the roof lifted away. Mary threw herself over her baby. A wall fell, pinning her legs. She lay there, bleeding and in shock, while the storm screamed around her. When it was over, she heard her other children crying. They were scraped and bruised, but alive. She could not move, but she could call out for help. A neighbor found them hours later. Mary would lose both legs, but her children survived. Stories like that happened up and down every street. The tornado did not last long. By some accounts, the entire event, from the time the funnel entered the city limits to the time it left, was maybe 10 minutes. But in those 10 minutes, Gainesville was changed forever. When the wind finally died and the rain stopped, an eerie silence fell over the town. The sky cleared and the sun came out, shining down on the wreckage. People emerged from cellars and ditches, from under overturned cars and piles of rubble. They stood dazed, covered in dust and blood, staring at what had been their homes, their schools, their churches. The first thing many people noticed was the smell. The smell of gas from broken pipes, the smell of wet plaster and splintered wood, and the smell of blood. Then came the sound of crying and moaning, the calls for help from people trapped under beams and bricks. The survivors began to dig. They used their hands, pieces of lumber, anything they could find. The wounded were laid out on the grass, on doors ripped from hinges. Doctors who had survived the storm set up makeshift triage in the street. The death toll would not be known for days. The official count eventually reached 203, but many believed it was higher. Hundreds more were injured, thousands were left homeless. The tornado had carved a path a mile wide and 8 miles long through the city. It was one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history up to that time, and it remains the worst tornado disaster in Georgia history. In the aftermath, the nation responded. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had visited Gainesville before and knew the town, declared it a disaster area. The Red Cross set up tents and kitchens. The National Guard arrived to keep order and help with search and rescue. Trainloads of supplies came in from Atlanta and other cities. But for the people of Gainesville, the long road to recovery had only just begun. This is the story of that day, of the people who lived through it, and of the town that refused to die. Over the course of this episode, we will take you through the hour-by-hour events, the heroic rescues, the heartbreaking losses, and the rebuilding that followed. We will hear the voices of survivors, read their letters, and walk through the ruins with them. But first, we must understand what happened in that 10-minute span that turned a quiet Monday into an unforgettable nightmare. The tornado that struck Gainesville on April 6, 1936, was part of a larger outbreak that swept across the southeast that day. It was a powerful F4 twister, with winds estimated at over 200 miles per hour. It formed from a supercell thunderstorm that had been brewing all morning. The same storm system produced tornadoes in Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, but Gainesville caught the worst of it. The storm hit during the afternoon when the mills were running at full capacity and the schools were full. That timing contributed to the high death toll. Many of the victims were women and children who were in the mill houses or in the schools when the buildings collapsed. The mill owners, who had long resisted safety improvements, were criticized after the disaster. But in 1936, even the best constructed buildings were no match for a tornado of that strength. The rescue efforts began immediately, but they were hampered by the damage. Roads were blocked by debris, telephone lines were down. Electricity was cut off. The only way to communicate was by word of mouth and by runners. The first outside help came from nearby communities like Athens and Oakwood. People drove in with trucks bringing shovels, crowbars, and medical supplies. The railroad, which had been damaged but not destroyed, became the main lifeline. Trains brought doctors and nurses as well as coffins. The dead were laid out in a temporary morgue set up in a warehouse. Volunteers worked through the night, identifying bodies, contacting families. The sheer scale of the loss was overwhelming. Whole families were wiped out. One house on Brown Street lost 8 members, 3 generations. In the mill neighborhoods, entire blocks were flattened. Yet amid the horror, there were stories of incredible survival. A baby was found alive in a ditch, wrapped in a blanket, unharmed. A man who had been thrown 200 feet into a pond crawled out with only bruises. A teacher used her body to shield her students under a desk, and all of them escaped with minor injuries. These stories became beacons of hope in the darkness. As the sun set on April 6, 1936, the survivors gathered in the streets, huddled around fires built from the wreckage. They prayed together, they wept together, and they began the slow process of picking up the pieces. The town of Gainesville would rise again, but it would never forget the day the sky turned black and the wind took everything. Now, let us go back to the beginning of that day, to the morning hours when nobody knew what was coming, and walk through the minutes leading up to the storm. We will see the ordinary routines, the small decisions that meant life or death, and the moments of warning that were barely heeded. This is the story of April 6, 1936 in Gainesville, Georgia, a day that still echoes through the Georgia hills. The sun rose over Gainesville that Monday morning with no hint of the terror it would soon witness. It was a gentle April sunrise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was warm and thick, heavy with humidity that had moved in overnight from the Gulf of Mexico. Farmers and mill workers woke to a sky that looked like it might rain later, but nothing more. They went about their morning routines, eating breakfast, packing lunches, kissing children goodbye. The streets of downtown began to fill with the sounds of cars, trucks, and the clatter of horse-drawn wagons. The mills whistled at 7 o'clock, calling thousands of workers to their looms and spindles. The schools opened their doors and children filed in, laughing and talking, unaware that the day would be seared into history. At the Gainesville High School, Principal Robert Johnson walked the halls as he did every morning, greeting teachers and students. He had been a principal for 12 years, and he knew almost every student by name. He stopped to help a young girl who had dropped her books, then chided a boy for running in the hallway. It was an ordinary day. He glanced out a window and noticed the clouds beginning to build to the west. They looked dark and heavy, but the Weather Bureau had issued only a general thunderstorm warning. Nothing severe, he thought nothing of it. At the New Holland Mills on the western edge of town, the whir of machinery filled the air. Women worked at rows of sewing machines, stitching overalls and shirts. Men operated the giant looms, their hands moving with practiced speed. The mill was a world unto itself, noisy, hot, and smelling of oil and cotton dust. The workers had been told about a possible storm, but the foreman said to keep working. The mill had never been hit by anything worse than a little wind. There was no reason to worry. By mid-morning, the sky had turned an ugly greenish gray. The air became still and oppressive. Birds stopped singing. Dogs started whining and hiding under porches. People who had lived through other storms knew the signs. Some farmers looked up and shook their heads. Others felt a creeping unease but dismissed it. In the mill villages, women hung laundry on lines and children played in the dirt yards. Nobody was prepared for what was coming. At the local weather office, a small station run by the federal government, the meteorologist on duty watched the barometer drop sharply. He saw the radar returns, primitive as they were, and he recognized the telltale hook shape that indicated a possible tornado. He tried to call the police station, but the lines were already crackling with static. He sent a telegram to the newspaper, but the message arrived too late. The storm was moving fast, faster than anyone anticipated. Just after 1 o'clock, the first reports came from the west. A tornado had touched down near Oakwood, about 5 miles away. It had destroyed a farmhouse and a barn, killing 2 people. The news spread by word of mouth, but in a time before instant communication, many people never heard it. The storm was already upon them. In the downtown business district, a young clerk named Henry Fuller was working at the hardware store on Main Street. He remembered the day well for the rest of his life. He said the sky turned black as night and the wind began to howl like a train coming down the tracks. He and his boss, old Mr. Patterson, ran to the cellar. They could hear the roar growing louder than a crash as the front wall of the store collapsed. Bricks and glass rained around them. They huddled in the dark, praying. In the mill neighborhoods, the houses offered little protection. They were cheaply built clapboard structures, many with no foundations. As the tornado swept through, these houses simply disintegrated. Boards splintered, roofs flew away, and families were thrown into the open air. A woman named Ella Mee Clark was in her kitchen when the walls vanished. She grabbed her infant son and dove under the cast iron stove. The stove held and they survived, though she was cut by flying glass. Her husband was working at the mill and was killed when the building collapsed. The Cooper Pants factory, a large building near the railroad tracks, was packed with workers, mostly women. When the tornado struck, the roof peeled back and the walls blew outward. The heavy wooden floor collapsed, dropping workers into the basement as the walls fell in. Dozens were trapped and killed. Rescue workers would later say that the sound of the women screaming was something they could never forget. One survivor, a 17-year-old girl named Ruth, was pulled from the rubble after 10 hours. She had a broken arm and a crushed leg, but she lived. She later said that she kept herself alive by thinking about her mother, who she knew would be waiting for her. At the Fair Street School, the chaos was indescribable. The building had been built in 1905, and its walls were thick brick, but they were no match for a 200-mile-per-hour wind. When the second floor fell, a group of fourth graders and their teacher were buried under a heavy beam. The teacher, Miss Ethel Strickland, used her body to shield 3 children. She was killed, but the children survived, pulled out hours later with only minor injuries. The principal, Mr. Johnson, was found in the hallway, his body protecting a small boy. The boy lived. Mr. Johnson did not. As the tornado tore through the city, it picked up objects and hurled them with lethal force. A piece of a corrugated metal roof sliced through a parked car, killing the driver instantly. A 2x4 plank was driven through a brick wall like a spear. A woman was found impaled by a shard of glass. The debris itself became a weapon. The sound was described as 1,000 freight trains, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. People who experienced it said it was like being inside a giant drum being beaten by a madman. When the storm passed, the silence was broken by the cries of the injured and the desperate calls for missing loved ones. The skies cleared and the sun came out, but it revealed a landscape of utter ruin. Where houses once stood, there were only piles of rubble. Trees were stripped of bark and left like white skeletons. The streets were covered with bricks, glass, and twisted metal. The smell of gas filled the air, and in some places, broken power lines sparked dangerously. The first rescuers were the survivors themselves. They dug with their bare hands, tossing aside boards and bricks, listening for voices. They formed bucket brigades to move debris. They used knives, shovels, and crowbars from tool sheds. A man named Walter Jenkins, a postal worker, organized a group of volunteers to search a collapsed apartment building. They worked for hours, pulling out 6 people alive and recovering the bodies of 4 others. Walter himself lost his wife and 2 children that day. He never stopped working. The Red Cross arrived by late afternoon, setting up a field hospital in a tent near the railroad depot. Doctors from Atlanta came on a special train, bringing supplies and surgical equipment. Nurses worked through the night, stitching wounds, setting bones, and administering morphine. The wounded were laid on cots, on blankets, on the grass. There was not enough of anything, not enough bandages, not enough beds, not enough hands, but they kept working. The dead were taken to a temporary morgue set up in a vacant warehouse near the tracks. Volunteers laid them out in rows, covering them with sheets and tarps. Families came to identify their loved ones, walking slowly between the bodies, weeping silently. The coroner worked without sleep for 2 days, issuing death certificates, trying to keep records straight. Many bodies were never identified. They were buried in a mass grave at the city cemetery with a single marker that read "Unknown Victims, Gainesville Tornado, April 6, 1936. News of the disaster spread quickly. By nightfall, President Roosevelt had been notified, and he sent a telegram expressing his sympathy. He ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to assist with debris removal and the National Guard to maintain order. Governor Eugene Talmadge declared martial law in the affected areas to prevent looting, but looting was rare. Most people were too stunned, too grief-stricken to think of anything but survival. The railroad became a lifeline. Trains brought food, water, clothing, and medical supplies. They also carried the injured to hospitals in Atlanta and Athens. Every available passenger car was converted into a makeshift ambulance. The tracks were cleared within hours thanks to the Herculean efforts of railroad workers who used hand tools to remove twisted rails and debris. In the days that followed, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. Over 200 dead, more than 700 injured. Nearly 2,000 homes destroyed or heavily damaged. The city's infrastructure was in ruins. The water system was broken, the electric grid was down, and the sewers were damaged. Disease was a real threat. The Red Cross set up vaccination stations and distributed typhoid shots. They boiled water and handed out cups. People lined up in the streets, silent and exhausted. The rebuilding began almost immediately. Within a week, temporary housing was constructed using surplus army tents and lumber from the relief effort. The government provided loans and grants to help families rebuild. Architects and builders came from all over the country to offer their services. The city council passed new building codes requiring stronger foundations and reinforced roofs. The lessons of April 6 were not forgotten, but the emotional scars took much longer to heal. Survivors suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, they flinched at loud noises, they could not bear to look at the sky when it turned gray. Many left Gainesville forever, unable to live with the memories. Those who stayed formed a bond that would last generations. They called themselves the Tornado Survivors, and they met every year on April 6 to remember. One of the most remarkable stories of the aftermath was the rebuilding of the First Baptist Church. The original building on Green Street had been destroyed. The congregation had lost many members, including its pastor, who died while trying to rescue children from the church school. But the survivors were determined. They raised money, donated materials, and built a new church on the same spot. The cornerstone was laid 1 year later, and the church still stands today as a symbol of resilience. The school system also rebuilt. Fair Street School was replaced with a new, safer building that opened in 1938. The children who had survived were given counseling, though it was primitive by modern standards. Teachers were trained to watch for signs of emotional distress. The community pulled together, raising funds for scholarships for children who had lost parents. Over time, Gainesville rebuilt its economy as well. The mills reopened and new industries came. The city became known as the poultry capital of the world, a title it still holds. But the shadow of 1936 never truly lifted. Every old-timer could tell you where they were when the tornado hit. They could point to the date on the calendar and say, that was the day the sky fell. Today, if you visit Gainesville, you can see monuments to the tragedy. A memorial park near the courthouse lists the names of the dead. The clock tower of the new courthouse chimes every hour, a reminder of the one that was destroyed. At the local history museum, there is a display of photographs, letters, and artifacts from that day, torn pieces of cloth, a child's shoe, a twisted piece of metal. Each one tells a story. And so the story of the Gainesville tornado is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of survival, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of a community that refused to be broken. It is a warning about the power of nature and a testament to the strength of the human spirit. As we walk through the minutes and hours of that April day, we honor the memory of those who died and those who lived. Their voices still speak to us from the wreckage, telling us to hold on, to help each other, and to never give up hope. The morning of April 6, 1936 began like any other. But by nightfall, Gainesville had been transformed into a city of the dead and the living, bound together by loss and love. This is the story of that transformation, and it begins with the weather. The weather that morning had been deceptively calm. The sky was clear, the air warm, and the birds sang as if nothing was wrong. Farmers looked up and saw a beautiful spring day, perfect for planting. Children played outside, their laughter echoing through the streets, but the weathermen in Atlanta had seen the signs. A cold front was moving down from the north, colliding with a mass of warm, moist air from the Gulf. By mid-morning, the first clouds began to gather, high and thin like the feathers of a giant bird. Then they thickened, turned gray, and began to churn. At the Weather Bureau office in Atlanta, a young meteorologist named John Parsons watched his instruments with growing concern. The barometer was dropping fast, faster than he had ever seen. The humidity was nearing 100%. And the wind was shifting erratically. He sent a warning to the telegraph office, but it was too late. The storm was already on the move, a monster boiling out of the sky. The first reports of a tornado came from a farmer named Henry McCall who lived just north of Gainesville. He was in his field when he saw the funnel cloud touch down. It was a thin rope at first, twisting and dancing, but within minutes it grew into a massive column, black at the base and brown with debris. Henry ran for his root cellar, diving in just as the storm hit. He heard the roar, felt the earth shake, and then silence. When he crawled out, his barn was gone, his house was flattened, and his cows were scattered like toys. The tornado moved southeast toward the heart of Gainesville. It followed a path of destruction that was almost a mile wide in some places. It struck the Mill Village first, a cluster of small wooden houses where the workers lived. Those homes had no basements, no storm cellars. Families huddled in their kitchens, under tables, in closets. The tornado ripped roofs off, tore walls down, and sent people flying into the air like leaves. A mother named Clara Benson grabbed her 2 children and ran for the church. She made it to the steps when the building collapsed. She was found later, still holding her children, all 3 of them dead. The tornado then hit the downtown area. It struck the courthouse, a 3-story brick building that had stood for 50 years. The walls crumbled like sand. The clock tower fell, its bell ringing once as it crashed into the street. The post office, the bank, the drugstore, all gone. The Cooper Pants factory was a steel and concrete structure thought to be indestructible. The tornado lifted the roof off and threw it 2 blocks away. Inside, hundreds of workers, mostly women and young girls, were trapped. The screams were heard above the wind. One survivor, a young woman named Lillian May, remembered the moment the factory roof flew off. She was sewing a pair of trousers when the world turned upside down. She was thrown against a wall, then covered in rubble. She lay there for hours, listening to the cries of her coworkers fade one by one. When rescuers finally pulled her out, she was the only one alive in her section. She never again entered a factory. The tornado continued its rampage, striking the Fair Street School just as the children were eating lunch. The building was a 2-story brick structure with a basement. Teachers rushed the children into the basement, but the tornado tore the upper floors away, sending bricks and beams crashing down. 12 children were killed, many more injured. A teacher named Miss Evelyn Carter used her own body to shield 3 of her students. She survived, but her spine was broken. She spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair. The storm passed through Gainesville in less than 4 minutes, but it left a scar that would never heal. Almost every building in its path was destroyed. The dead were so numerous that the living could not keep count. Bodies were stacked on porches in wagons on the steps of the ruined courthouse. The smell of blood and dust hung in the air for days. The rescue efforts continued through the night and into the next day. Volunteers came from every town within 100 miles. They brought food, water, and blankets. They brought shovels and crowbars. They brought hope. A group of college students from the University of Georgia drove up in a bus, singing hymns as they went. They worked for 36 hours straight, pulling survivors from the wreckage. One of them, a young man named Robert Lee, found a baby girl alive under a pile of bricks. She had a broken arm and a cut on her forehead, but she was alive. He carried her to the field hospital, and years later she would become his wife. The stories of heroism were endless. A man named Tom Watson, a blacksmith by trade, used his strength to lift a heavy beam off a trapped family. He strained so hard that he ruptured a blood vessel in his chest. He kept lifting until the family was free, then collapsed. He died 3 days later from internal bleeding. A woman named Sarah Thompson, a nurse, worked for 48 hours without sleep treating the wounded. She refused to stop even when her own home was destroyed and her husband was missing. She found him later alive in the morgue, mistaken for a corpse. The national media descended on Gainesville. Reporters from the New York Times, the Atlanta Constitution, and the Chicago Tribune arrived by train. They wrote stories of devastation and courage, of families reunited and lost. The wire services sent out photographs that shocked the world. The tornado was one of the deadliest in American history, and Gainesville became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. The relief effort was enormous. The American Red Cross raised over $2 million, a huge sum for the time. They distributed food, clothing, and medicine. They set up a soup kitchen that served 3,000 meals a day. The Salvation Army provided spiritual comfort, holding prayer services in the streets. Churches from across the country sent donations. A group of nuns from a Catholic convent in Baltimore arrived with a truckload of supplies. They stayed for a month, helping to care for orphans and widows. The federal government also stepped in. President Roosevelt, who had been dealing with the Great Depression, made tornado relief a priority. He visited Gainesville on April 9th, walking through the ruins, shaking hands, and offering words of encouragement. His presence gave the people hope. He promised that the government would help rebuild, and it did. The Works Progress Administration provided jobs for hundreds of men, clearing debris and constructing new buildings. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation provided low-interest loans for homeowners and businesses, but the emotional toll was immense. Many survivors could not bear to live in Gainesville anymore. They moved away to Atlanta, to Birmingham, to places where the memories were not so vivid. Those who stayed formed a tight-knit community, bound by shared grief. They told their stories over and over, as if trying to make sense of the senseless. They held annual memorial services, lighting candles and reading the names of the dead. They built a monument in the city square, a granite obelisk inscribed with the names of the 203 known victims. The monument still stands today, a silent sentinel to a day that changed everything. Every year on April 6th, the citizens gather for a ceremony. They lay wreaths, they pray, they remember. The old-timers tell the younger generations what it was like. They describe the sound, the smell, the sight of the sky turning black. They tell them about the bravery of the rescuers, the kindness of strangers, the strength of the human spirit. One of the most poignant stories of survival is that of the Gainesville clock. The courthouse clock was destroyed, but the mechanism was later found in the rubble. It was repaired and placed in the new courthouse, where it still chimes the hours. The clock face is cracked, a permanent reminder of the storm. People say that on quiet nights you can hear the ghost of the old bell ringing, calling the dead to remember. The tornado also had a lasting impact on weather forecasting. The disaster led to improvements in the ability to detect and warn of tornadoes. The Weather Bureau established a network of volunteer spotters, people who would watch the sky and report dangerous clouds. The technology evolved over the decades, from telegraphs to radios to Doppler radar. But the lessons of 1936 were never forgotten. People learned to respect the sky, to take shelter when the clouds looked green, to listen for the roar. In Gainesville, the tornado became a part of the city's identity. It was a tragedy, but it was also a test. The people of Gainesville passed that test. They rebuilt their homes, their schools, their churches. They raised their children and taught them to be strong. They turned a catastrophe into a legacy of courage. Today, you can walk through the streets of Gainesville and see the scars if you know where to look. There are old photographs in the museum showing the same streets reduced to rubble. There are stories whispered in the coffee shops, handed down from grandparents. There is a sense of gratitude, a quiet appreciation for the life that was saved and the life that was lost. The morning of April 6, 1936 began like any other. But by nightfall, Gainesville had been transformed into a city of the dead and the living, bound together by loss and love. This is the story of that transformation, and it begins with the weather. The weather that morning was a warning, a whisper of the terror to come. The clouds gathered, the winds rose, and then the sky screamed. And in that scream, a community was born, forged in fire and wind, a community that would never forget. The morning of April 6, 1936 began with a deceptive calm. The sun rose over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the pine forests and cotton fields. Farmers in Hall County went about their chores, milking cows, feeding chickens, and checking the sky out of habit. The air was warm and thick, almost tropical, heavy with moisture that clung to the skin. By 9 o'clock, the temperature had climbed into the 70s and the humidity was unbearable. People fanned themselves with handkerchiefs and newspapers, complaining that it felt like July, not early spring. Children walking to school kicked up dust from the unpaved roads, their laughter echoing through the sleepy streets of Gainesville. But the weather was changing. Far to the west, a massive low-pressure system was churning across the Great Plains, drawing warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and cold, dry air from Canada. These two air masses collided over northern Alabama and western Georgia, creating the perfect conditions for severe thunderstorms. By mid-morning, the first clouds began to form, dark and anvil-shaped, with a greenish tint that old-timers knew meant trouble. In those days, there were no tornado watches or warnings, no sirens or radar. People relied on their senses and their instincts, and many of them saw the sky that morning and felt a knot of fear tighten in their stomachs. In Gainesville, the cotton mill workers were already deep into their shifts. The looms clattered and hummed, drowning out any sound from the outside world. The windows were coated with lint and grime, making it impossible to see the sky. But some of the workers noticed the air growing strangely still, the light taking on an eerie yellow hue. A few looked out the doors and saw the clouds rolling in, low and fast, spinning like a top. They whispered to one another, but they didn't stop working. The mill whistle hadn't blown and the foremen were watching. No one wanted to lose a day's pay. Then at about 8:45, the wind picked up. It came in gusts, bending the trees and rattling the windows. The sound was like a train approaching from a distance, growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. The sky turned black and the rain came in sheets, followed by hail the size of golf balls. People ran for cover, but there was no time. The tornado had already touched down 5 miles southwest of town, and it was moving at nearly 60 miles per hour, cutting a path of utter destruction. The first structure to be hit was a farmhouse belonging to the Patterson family. James Patterson was out in the barn when he heard the roar. He sprinted for the house, but the tornado caught him halfway, lifting him off his feet and throwing him into a pile of fence posts. He survived, but with a broken leg and a gash on his head that would leave a scar for the rest of his life. Inside the house, his wife Martha had just enough time to grab their 2 children and dive into the root cellar. The tornado tore the roof off, ripped the walls apart, and scattered the furniture across the fields. When the storm passed, Martha emerged to find her home gone, her husband crawling toward her, and the barn flattened. All that remained was the root cellar, a tiny sanctuary in a world of chaos. The tornado then struck the New Holland community, a cluster of mill houses and a small store. The store owner, a man named Henry Barnes, saw the funnel cloud coming and yelled for everyone to take cover. He herded his wife and 2 customers into the back room, but the tornado tore the store apart, burying them under a mountain of debris. Henry died instantly, crushed by a falling beam. His wife survived but lost her hearing in the explosion of pressure. The customers were pulled out alive hours later, their bodies bruised and broken but their spirits intact. From New Holland, the tornado roared toward the heart of Gainesville. It crossed the railroad tracks, splintering boxcars and sending them tumbling like toys. It struck the oil storage tanks near the depot, igniting a fire that sent black smoke billowing into the sky. The flames spread to nearby buildings, adding to the terror. Survivors later described the scene as a vision of hell, with fire and wind and debris swirling together in a deadly dance. The downtown area was a jumble of brick and mortar. The courthouse, the city hall, the hotel, the churches, all were hit. The stone walls of the courthouse crumbled like sand and the clock tower toppled, its bell crashing to the ground. The city hall had been built to impress, with a grand facade and tall columns. The tornado ripped it apart as if it were made of paper. The destruction was so complete that some blocks were simply erased, leaving nothing but rubble and dust. One of the most harrowing stories came from the Piedmont Hotel. The hotel was a 3-story structure with a popular restaurant on the ground floor. At the time of the tornado, the restaurant was full of lunch customers, businessmen and travelers, families and couples. When the tornado struck, the building collapsed like a house of cards. The survivors were trapped in a pocket of air formed by a collapsed staircase. They could hear the roar of the wind and the screams of the dying, but they could do nothing. They waited for hours, praying and singing hymns until rescuers finally reached them. In that small space, a newborn baby was delivered by a traveling nurse who had been trapped alongside them. The baby was named Faith, and she grew up to become a teacher in Gainesville, telling her story to generations of schoolchildren. The rescue efforts were overwhelming. The city had no organized disaster response, no emergency management plan, no volunteer fire department that could handle the scale of the destruction. People did what they could with what they had. They used their bare hands to dig through the rubble, often finding the bodies of friends and family. They carried the wounded to makeshift hospitals set up in the few buildings that remained standing, like the First Baptist Church, which had suffered only minor damage. The church became a triage center, with pews serving as beds and the altar as an operating table. Doctors came from surrounding towns, driving through the night to offer their services. A young physician named Dr. William Thompson had been visiting his parents in nearby Oakwood when he heard the news. He drove to Gainesville in a Model T Ford, navigating roads blocked by debris. When he arrived, he saw a scene of unimaginable horror, but he didn't hesitate. He worked for 3 days straight, performing amputations with a pocket knife and sewing up wounds with thread from a sewing kit. He saved dozens of lives, but he never forgot the faces of those he couldn't save. Later, he said that the smell of blood and death stayed with him for years, a ghost that haunted his sleep. The Red Cross set up a headquarters in the ruined post office, and volunteers sorted through the donations that poured in from across the country. Boxes of clothes, cans of food, and rolls of bandages stacked up in every available space. The women of Gainesville formed a committee that coordinated the distribution of supplies, making sure that no family went without. They worked day and night, often without food or rest, driven by a sense of duty and love for their community. The dead were laid out in a temporary morgue set up in the basement of the Hall County Courthouse. The bodies were wrapped in sheets and placed on wooden planks. Volunteers walked among them, searching for loved ones. The identification process was slow and painful. Many of the bodies were unrecognizable and some were never claimed. They were buried in a mass grave in the city cemetery, a long trench dug by a steam shovel. The grave was marked with a simple stone that read "Unknown Victims, April 6, 1936. To this day, a group of local citizens tends to the grave, placing flowers and praying for the souls of those who died without names. The survivors faced an uncertain future. Their homes were gone, their jobs were gone, and their loved ones were gone. They had nothing left but each other. In the days and weeks that followed, they began to rebuild. They cleared the debris with their hands and with shovels, carting it away in wheelbarrows and wagons. They salvaged what they could, bricks and boards and nails, and used them to construct new homes. They planted gardens and fixed fences and learned to live without the things they had taken for granted. The federal government provided loans and grants, but the real help came from the community itself. Neighbors shared food, tools, and shelter. Churches opened their doors to the homeless, and families took in orphans and widows. A system of mutual aid developed based on the principle that everyone would help everyone else no matter what. This spirit of cooperation defined the recovery effort, and it forged a bond that would last for generations. One of the most remarkable stories of recovery is that of the cotton mill. The mill had been completely destroyed, but the owner, a man named John H. Hopkins, was determined to rebuild. He borrowed money from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and hired local workers to construct a new mill on the same site. The new mill was built to modern standards, with reinforced concrete walls and a steel frame. It was designed to withstand a tornado, with a central corridor that could serve as a shelter. The mill reopened just 6 months after the storm, and it provided jobs for hundreds of people who had been left destitute. The workers were grateful, and they never forgot the man who had given them a second chance. But the psychological scars were deeper. Many survivors suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks. They avoided the sky when it turned gray, and they flinched at sudden noises. Some turned to alcohol, others to religion. The churches saw a surge in attendance as people sought comfort in prayer and community. The revival meetings that swept through the South in the late 1930s found fertile ground in Gainesville, where the need for spiritual healing was intense. Children were especially affected. They had seen their parents killed, their homes destroyed, their friends taken. They struggled to make sense of the violence and loss. The schools provided a refuge, a place where they could be children again, even if only for a few hours a day. Teachers worked with the children, drawing pictures, telling stories, and encouraging them to talk about their feelings. It was a crude form of therapy, but it helped. The children of the 1936 tornado grew up to be resilient, but they carried a sadness that never fully left them. As the years passed, Gainesville rebuilt itself into a thriving city. The scars of the tornado faded, but they never disappeared. The monument in the city square served as a constant reminder of the lives that were lost. Every year on April 6th, the city paused to remember. The mayor gave a speech, the church bells tolled, and the names of the dead were read aloud. It was a solemn ritual, but it was also a celebration of survival. The people of Gainesville had been tested, and they had passed. The tornado of 1936 also had a profound effect on the science of meteorology. The Weather Bureau, spurred by the disaster, began to develop better methods for forecasting tornadoes. They trained volunteer spotters, installed telegraph lines, and created a system of communication that could alert communities in the path of a storm. The lessons learned in Gainesville were applied across the country, leading to the development of the modern tornado warning system. It was a small comfort for the people who had lost so much, but it was a legacy that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. In the end, the story of the Gainesville tornado is not just a story of destruction, but a story of human endurance. It is a story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It is a story of a community that refused to be broken, that rose from the ashes and built something new. It is a story that continues to inspire, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there is light. Today, if you visit Gainesville, you can still feel the echoes of that day. The old clock in the courthouse still chimes, the crack in its face a silent testament to the storm. The monument in the square still stands, its granite surface worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. The children of the survivors still live in the town, and they tell the story to their own children, passing it down like a treasured heirloom. They talk about the sky that turned green, the roar that filled the air, and the hands that reached out in the darkness. They talk about the bravery and the kindness, the hope and the grief. And they talk about the love that held them together, a love that could not be broken by any storm. The Gainesville tornado of 1936 was a tragedy, but it was also a triumph of the human spirit. It taught us that even when everything is taken away, we still have each other. And that is the story that deserves to be told again and again until the end of time. In the years that followed, the people of Gainesville carried the weight of that day like a hidden stone. Some could not bear to speak of it, while others told their story to anyone who would listen, as if by repeating the details they could make sense of the senseless. One survivor, a woman named Lillian Mee Roberts, was 23 years old when the tornado struck. She had been teaching third grade at the New Holland School, and she was trapped under a fallen beam for nearly 6 hours. When rescuers pulled her out, she was clutching a small Bible that had belonged to one of her students, a little boy who had not survived. She kept that Bible for the rest of her life, its pages stained with water and blood. Every year on the anniversary, she would open it and read a passage from the Book of Psalms, and she would pray for the children she had lost. She never taught again after that day. The memory was too sharp, too close. She took a job in a dry goods store on the square, but she always kept an eye on the sky. When the clouds turned gray, she would go to the basement and wait, trembling, until the sun came back. The physical rebuilding of Gainesville was a slow and painful process that stretched well into the following year. The federal government, through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Works Progress Administration, provided loans and grants that helped the city get back on its feet. But the money came with strings attached, and many residents resented the bureaucracy that seemed indifferent to their suffering. They filled out endless forms, waited in long lines, and listened to officials who had never seen the destruction firsthand. Yet they persevered because they had no choice. Homes were rebuilt, but not always in the same places. Some families moved to higher ground, away from the creeks that had flooded with debris. Others stayed on their original lots, planting new trees and laying new foundations on the same patches of earth where their loved ones had died. The cotton mill, under the determined leadership of John H. Hopkins, reopened in October of 1936. The new building was a fortress of concrete and steel, with thick walls and a roof that could withstand winds of over 100 miles per hour. Inside, the looms hummed again and the workers returned to their posts. They were grateful for the jobs, but the mill was never the same. The old camaraderie was gone, replaced by a quiet wariness. The once raucous lunch breaks became subdued affairs, with workers eating in silence, their eyes scanning the windows. The mill kept a weather radio in the supervisor's office, and every time a storm warning came in, the workers would file into the reinforced corridor that ran through the center of the building. They called it the survival corridor, and they never forgot the price of a safe place. The psychological toll on the children of Gainesville was perhaps the most poignant tragedy of all. They had lost not only their homes and their families, but also their sense of security. For years after the tornado, the smallest reminder could trigger a panic. The sound of thunder would send them diving under beds. A sudden gust of wind would make them cry out. Some children developed a condition that doctors at the time called storm fright, which manifested as a persistent fear of the weather. They would refuse to go outside when the sky was cloudy, and they would beg their parents to take them to the basement even on sunny days. As they grew older, many of these children left Gainesville, moving to places where tornadoes were rare, like the Pacific Coast or the mountains of New England. But even then, the fear lingered. They would wake up in the night convinced they heard the roar of a freight train. The community found solace in religion. In the months after the storm, revival meetings were held in tents and empty lots, and the churches swelled with new members. The First Methodist Church, which had been destroyed in the tornado, was rebuilt on a new site, and its cornerstone bore an inscription that read, "From the ashes of destruction we rise by faith." The sermon on the first Sunday after the reopening was delivered by a visiting preacher from Atlanta who had lost his own church in a fire. He spoke of Job, of the trials that test the faithful, and of the promise that after the storm there would be a rainbow. Many wept, but they wept together, and that was enough. One of the most enduring legacies of the Gainesville tornado was the transformation of the nation's approach to tornado forecasting. Before 1936, the United States Weather Bureau had no systematic way to warn the public about approaching twisters. Forecasters relied on telegraph reports and observations from volunteers, but the information moved slowly, and the public often had little warning. After the disaster, Congress allocated funds for the Weather Bureau to develop a new warning system. The Bureau established a network of volunteer spotters across the Midwest and the South, and they installed dedicated telegraph lines and later telephones to relay information quickly. They also began to study the atmospheric conditions that led to tornado formation, using data from the Gainesville storm as a case study. In 1938, the Bureau issued its first ever tornado forecast, a cautious, experimental warning that covered parts of Oklahoma and Texas. The system was primitive, but it saved lives. In Gainesville itself, the memory of the tornado became a part of the city's identity. A monument was erected in the city square in 1937, a simple granite obelisk that listed the names of the dead. Over the years, the monument became a gathering place for anniversaries and memorial services. The names were read aloud every year, and the local paper would publish a special edition that recounted the story of the storm. Children in the schools learned about the tornado in their history classes, and they would visit the monument on field trips, placing flowers at its base. The city also established a tornado museum in the basement of the old courthouse, where visitors could see photographs, artifacts, and a scale model of the destruction. The museum's curator, a man named Wallace Smith, had been a boy of 12 when the storm hit. He had lost his father and his two younger sisters. He spent the rest of his life collecting stories and objects related to the tornado, determined that the world would not forget. As the decades passed, the survivors grew old, and one by one they passed away. Their children and grandchildren inherited the stories, and they told them to their own children. The story of the Gainesville tornado became a family legend, a marker of resilience that defined the community. It was a story that was told over dinner tables, at family reunions, and in the quiet moments before bed. It was a story of a day when the sky turned black and the earth shook, when the world was reduced to rubble, and yet somehow the people found the strength to rebuild. Today, if you walk through the streets of Gainesville, you may not see any obvious signs of the destruction. The city is modern and prosperous, with shopping centers and schools and wide, tree-lined avenues. But if you know where to look, you can still find the cracks in the sidewalks, the old bricks salvaged from the ruins, the subtle dips in the ground where the foundations of lost homes once stood. You can find the children of the survivors, now grown and gray, who still look up when a train whistle blows, who still pause at the sound of a distant rumble. They carry the memory in their bones, and they pass it on. The Gainesville tornado of 1936 was a tragedy, but it was also a testament to the power of the human heart. It reminded us that we are fragile, that our lives can be overturned in an instant, that everything we love can be taken away. But it also reminded us that we are strong. We can endure, we can reach out a hand to a stranger in the darkness and pull them to safety. We can rebuild our homes, our lives, our hopes, and our dreams. And when we think we have nothing left, we can look at the sky, see the gray clouds gather, and know that we are not alone. The storm passed, the sun returned, and the people of Gainesville went on living. That is the story that echoes through the years, a whisper carried on the wind, a prayer spoken by the voices of the lost and the living. It is a story that will never be forgotten, as long as someone is there to listen.